there's two things I'm doing. From the point of view of what I hope to bring is I'm convening the narrating time sub-theme, because I've noticed that a lot of other disciplines at the moment seem to be using the word narrative. You'll find it in politics, you'll find it in medicine, even in business studies, and also in subjects where you'd expect to find it more like history or psychology, say. And I just thought that was interesting, and I wanted to find out what these other subjects were doing with the notion of narrative, and whether English studies might learn something from that, but also whether these other subjects might learn something from coming and talking to the literary critics and seeing if they can gain from what we understand by narrative.
Do you feel that the term narrative is being abused, or do you welcome the idea of narrative taking on this extra hinterland?
Well, both, I think. I do think sometimes it's being abused, and I think sometimes narrative is being used to refer to one thing that happens after another. And I think, well, maybe in literature we tend to employ more complex models than that, and perhaps these other subjects might gain from that. But also, I mean, I really welcome the way in which terms from our discipline might get used by other disciplines, so that we get this interaction with them. I think we both gain from that.
Could you explain a bit more about that more complex definition of a narrative, the way you would understand it, that perhaps is missing from that popular definition?
Yeah, sure. Well, one distinction that we find very useful in my own subject is the distinction between plot and narrative. And plot is stuff that just happens one thing after another, because time tends to move in one direction in the real world, whereas narrative is the telling of that story, the telling of that plot. And narrative can do whatever it likes. It jumps all over the place, and this is something that's particularly characteristic of literary narratives. I mean, right back to Homer, say. I mean, the Iliad doesn't start with the judgment of Paris. It starts well into the Trojan War with Achilles sulking in his tent, and the rest of the story gets recovered afterwards. So narrative, if you like, is out of time, whereas plot is in time. Or if you think about a detective story, where often the beginning of the narrative is the discovery of the body, whereas the beginning of the plot is the murder itself. That the narrative of a detective story is not the story of the crime, but the story of the investigation. So I think once you start looking for more complex models of the relationship between storytelling and time, you start finding them all over the place.
So it's not necessarily linear, the definition that you're looking at?
Absolutely, that's absolutely it. I mean, I have a colleague working in business who works with interviewing people about the narratives of their own lives, and often they won't start like Robinson Crusoe with "I was born in York in the year whatever." They will start with a particular incident from their own life that typifies the story they want to tell. Well, I remember on my first day in this job, that they'll start a story partway through, and then the narrative then develops outwards from that.
You have a particular expertise in late 19th century and early 20th century fiction. And of course that falls very much, H.G. Wells is in that area. Can it be a coincidence that you're engaging with the time theme, but also a huge fan of H.G. Wells?
Yeah, well, inevitably time travelling has come into it, and I've been looking at the notion of mental time travelling in psychology, the way in which memory is a kind of mental time travelling. But I think I'd want to open time travel out to all stories are a kind of time travelling, not just stories about time machines. For instance, the project that I'm working on at the moment, alongside the Narrating Time project, is something on Dickens and autobiography. That Dickens was taken out of school when he was a child and sent out to work in the blacking warehouse, and there are accounts of Dickens that inscribe this as the traumatic event in his life. This was what this is what wounded him into being a great artist, and without the blacking factory there'd have been no Great Expectations and Pickwick Papers and things like that. And I'm a bit sceptical about that, because I think we all of us travel back in time mentally to our own childhood memories, and I've been wondering whether the traumatic event is not so much the plot of the blacking factory episode, but the narrative of it. What's so traumatic for Dickens is having to remember it.
Right.
So there is a kind of I'm interpreting the term time travel perhaps very generously and very very broadly there, but I think since autobiographical narratives are what I'm working on at the moment, I think that's a really fascinating sort of time travelling.
Of course, you're engaged, you're professor of English, but you're engaged with the IAS for the time theme and this narrative that you've outlined. Do you feel that the Institute of Advanced Studies serves an important purpose, not just within the life of Durham University, but perhaps has a broader national or even international function?
I think the main value of the IAS is that it's such a fantastic think space. I think even when you're in your own department, you're driven by a set of priorities and a set of agendas that we have to meet certain targets, and obviously that rightly so, that we need to sing for our supper as academics, and we should be expected to produce and to do certain things. But the real value of the IAS is that it's an environment where the creation of new ideas is at its purest within the university. I mean, within the other institutes and centres as well, of course, but the IAS more than any of the others, for me at least. And I think once those ideas are born here, or you have those encounters with ideas in other disciplines that you then take back to your own subject and try and shape and influence them, then that's where you begin to drive larger or international agendas. So I think it does happen, but it starts here.